Imagine standing on the deck of a commercial tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. You have been waiting for weeks of anchoring, of rationing supplies, of watching the news cycle on a satellite phone and hoping that this crisis somehow find a reason to stop shooting long enough for you to go home. Then you hear it, the unmistakable sound of an aircraft engine overhead, and then a missile hits your ship, not a drone, not a warning shot, a precision-guided missile fires directly into your vessel's engine room. In one moment, everything that was theory, the war, the blockade, the standoff in the Strait of Hormuz becomes brutally, undeniably real. This is not a story from a past war. This is what is happening right now in the most critical maritime choke point in the world, where the United States is disabling ships with Hellfire missiles, Iran is firing ballistic missiles at American warships and state military bases, and approximately 1,500 commercial vessels carrying 20,000 trapped sailors are caught between two nuclear threshold powers with no safe exit and no clear timeline for when any of this ends. What you are about to hear is the full detailed account of the most dangerous ongoing maritime confrontation the world has witnessed in generations, not in summary, not softened, but in the complete operational, economic, and human reality of what is actually happening inside the Strait of Hormuz. Right now, this is the story of Iran's deadly missile campaign, the U.S. decision to bomb ships with combat aircraft, the trapped maritime workers nobody is talking about, and the cascade of consequences that is reshaping the global economy one destroyed tanker at a time. Like and subscribe because this story is changing every single day, and you deserve to understand the full picture of what is at stake. To understand the current confrontation, you need to understand the sequence of decisions that led to it, because none of this happened suddenly, when the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28, 2026, striking Iranian nuclear sites and killing Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Iran did not simply fire missiles and call it a day. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz completely. The IRG transmitted warnings via radio to every vessel in the strait: no ship is allowed to pass. By March 2nd, the IRG officially confirmed the strait was closed to all unfriendly nations. By March 4th, Iran's navy announced it had achieved complete control of the waterway. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was the most consequential maritime blockade imposed by any nation since the Second World War, a country physically seizing control of the channel through which approximately 20% of the entire world's daily oil supply had been flowing. The tools Iran used to enforce the closure were sophisticated and varied. Bottom influence sea mines were laid across the navigable channels, the same narrow 21-mile wide passage that all commercial traffic must use to transit between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Fast inshore attack craft from the IRG Navy operating out of Bandar Abbas, Larak Island, and Keshem patrolled the waters and threatened any vessel attempting to pass without Iranian approval. Anti-ship cruise missiles stored in underground bunkers along the Iranian coastline provided long-range coverage, and drones provided persistent surveillance and threat delivery across the entire area of operations. The combination of mines, fast boats, missiles, and drones made the strait genuinely impassable for non-Iranian shipping, not because Iran's military is stronger than America's, but because the geography of the strait made even a small defensive capability enormously effective. 21 miles of navigable water is simply not enough space the way of a determined adversary with missiles. The economic consequences of the closure hit the global economy almost immediately. Oil prices spiked above $100 per barrel as the markets priced in the loss of the world's most critical energy corridor. 20% of global oil exports, 25% of global seaborne oil trade gone or rerouted at enormous cost around the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa, adding weeks of travel time and hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional fuel costs per voyage. The Aramco CEO warned publicly that if tankers continued to be unable to transit the strait, the impact on the global economy would be severe. Global shipping firms, insurance companies, and energy trading desks all went into crisis mode simultaneously, and inside the strait itself, ships that had been partway through their transit when the closure was announced found themselves stranded, unable to go forward, unable to go back, sitting in contested waters with no safe harbor and no resolution in sight. Like and subscribe because what happened to those stranded ships and the 20,000 sailors trapped inside the Gulf is one of the most urgent and underreported human stories of this entire conflict. The United Nations International Maritime Organization's Secretary General confirmed that approximately 1,500 ships and 20,000 crew members were trapped inside the Persian Gulf due to the conflict. Think about that number for a moment: 20,000. Human beings, mariners from the Philippines, India, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and dozens of other countries sitting on vessels that cannot move, in waters that are being actively patrolled by Iranian gunboats, under skies covered by Iranian drones, with supplies running low and no timeline for when the situation might resolve. These are not soldiers. These are civilian sailors doing a commercial job. They became prisoners of a geopolitical confrontation they had nothing to do with. And the world moved on to the next news cycle while they sat in the heat of the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go. The United States' response to Iran's strait closure went through several phases, each more aggressive than the last. In the first weeks, the focus was on degrading Iran's anti-ship missile capability from the air. On March 17, 2026, CENTCOM deployed multiple GBU-72 advanced 5,000-pound deep penetrator munitions, what most people call bunker-busting bombs, against hardened Iranian missile sites along the coastline near the strait. These are extraordinary weapons. The GBU-72 is specifically designed to penetrate layers of rock and reinforced concrete before detonating, destroying underground facilities that conventional bombs simply cannot reach. Iran had spent decades building what military analysts called underground missile cities, buried bunkers storing cruise missiles, mobile missile launchers, and anti-ship weapons in hardened tunnels carved into the rough terrain of the Iranian coastline overlooking the Hormuz. The GBU-72 strikes targeted that infrastructure directly. CENTCOM Admiral Brad Cooper confirmed the strikes and said bluntly that his pilots had clear orders. They would not stop. The U.S. government declared that the Iranian anti-ship missile capability in the strait had been significantly degraded, though independent analysts cautioned that destroying launch infrastructure does not guarantee that all missiles have been eliminated. And here is what should make every viewer stop and reconsider the narrative they have been hearing. Iran's underground missile cities were not built overnight. They were decades in the making, hardened, buried, dispersed across a rugged coastline specifically to survive exactly the kind of American airstrikes that hit them on March 17. The fact that the United States needed 5,000-pound bunker-busting bombs to even get to them tells you something important about how seriously Iran had prepared for a direct military confrontation. This was not improvisation. This was a military infrastructure built over years, specifically calibrated to hold the Strait of Hormuz at risk even under sustained American air attack. Like and subscribe, because the depth of Iran's military preparation for this confrontation is something the mainstream narrative is still not fully explaining. As the air campaign against Iran's Strait-side missile infrastructure continued, the U.S. also launched what it called Project Freedom, a military operation announced by President Trump on May 4, 2026, specifically aimed at freeing the approximately 1,500 trapped commercial vessels and reopening the strait to international shipping. The operation was massive in scale. CENTCOM mobilized 15,000 personnel and more than 100 aircraft under the command of Admiral Brad Cooper. Two guided missile destroyers, USS Truxtun and USS Mason, transited the strait as the vanguard of the operation, escorting US flagged merchant vessels through waters still contested by Iran. The global shipping firm Maersk's vessel Alliance Fairfax became the first publicly named commercial ship to transit the strait under US military escort. Iran's response was immediate and violent. The IRG launched a sustained barrage of small fast attack boats, missiles, and drones against the U.S. convoy. CENTCOM confirmed that American forces destroyed 6, later reported as 7, Iranian fast inshore attack craft during the transit. The destroyers came under attack but were unscathed. 2 US flagged merchant vessels made it through the strait on the first day of Project Freedom. Trump announced the operation on Truth Social, writing that countries from all over the world had asked the United States to help free their ships' vessels that were, in his words, merely neutral and innocent bystanders in a conflict they had nothing to do with. Iran claimed the operation was a ceasefire violation. CENTCOM said it was a legitimate freedom of navigation mission. Both sides were firing weapons, and Pakistan, which had been acting as a mediator in US-Iran peace talks, asked Washington not to proceed with Project Freedom while negotiations were still underway. Project Freedom was paused within 24 hours of its launch, with Trump citing deal progress as the reason for the suspension. The pause reflected a broader reality that has defined the entire Hormuz standoff. The United States is simultaneously trying to force the strait open through military means and negotiate a diplomatic resolution that makes the military action unnecessary. These two objectives are in permanent tension with each other, because every ship the U.S. escorts through at gunpoint and every Iranian fast boat it sinks in the process makes Iran less willing to agree to terms that look like capitulation and more willing to escalate further to prove that the cost of forcing the strait open by force is too high for Washington to sustain politically. The ship disabling operations that accompanied and followed Project Freedom introduced a new dimension to the confrontation that deserves careful attention. The U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports, imposed on April 13, 2026, following the failure of Islamabad peace talks, gave CENTCOM the legal basis under its own interpretation to intercept and disable vessels attempting to breach the blockade and reach Iranian ports. The methods used have ranged from the dramatic to the strategically calculated. An IFA-18E Super Hornet launched from the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln fired its 20 mm cannon at the Iranian-flagged tanker MRT Hasna, destroying its rudder and leaving it immobilized in the water. CENTCOM released footage of the engagement. The crew had, according to the U.S. military, ignored repeated warnings and failed to comply with directions to stop the Botswana-flagged oil. Tanker MRT Lexi was struck by a Hellfire missile fired into its engine room, a precision-guided Air-2 ground weapon typically mounted on helicopters and drones, disabling the vessel before it could reach an Iranian port. CENTCOM posted a video of the missile strike publicly. It was the sixth ship disabled in blockade enforcement since April. The footage showed the moment of impact, a precise strike directly into the propulsion system of a large commercial vessel designed to stop the ship without sinking it or creating a catastrophic fuel spill. This is deliberate. The U.S. has consistently targeted propulsion systems and rudders rather than cargo holds or crew quarters, a calibrated use of force designed to enforce the blockade while limiting collateral casualties and environmental damage. But the message to the global shipping market is unmistakable. Any vessel attempting to reach an Iranian portee without American authorization will be stopped by a fighter jet, by a Hellfire missile, by a cannon. The specific weapon used is less important than the principle it enforces. The blockade is real, it is backed by lethal force, and it applies to every flag state. By early May 2026, CENTCOM reported that U.S. forces had redirected 116 commercial vessels and disabled multiple ships in support of the blockade. The economic impact on Iran was being measured by the U.S. government at approximately $500 million per day in lost revenue, the value of the oil exports that could not leave Iranian ports while the blockade was in force. Iran had also seized 2 cargo ships in retaliation, holding their crews as effective hostages in a form of maritime counter-pressure designed to demonstrate that the costs of the blockade were not exclusively Iran's to bear. Iran's own missile campaign during this period was relentless, multi-directional, and deliberately designed to spread fear and co-street across the entire region. The IRG described its attacks as waves. By March 11, it was already claiming its 37th wave of attacks, targeting U.S. military bases, allied Gulf states, and commercial shipping. Simultaneously, Iranian Revolutionary Guard gunboats fired on 2 tankers in the Strait of Hormuz in a single day. A vessel called the maritime bulk carrier was photographed with smoke rising from its deck after an Iranian strike near the Hormuz transit zone. 3 vessels, including a container ship, the maritime, and a cargo vessel named Express Rome, were all hit by suspected projectiles within a 3-hour window inside the same transit zone. An explosion caused a fire in the engine room of the South Korean vessel Humnamu. The Way-flagged ADNOC tanker was targeted in the strait, triggering a condemnation from the Gulf Cooperation Council's Secretary General, who described Iran's attacks on shipping as piracy and a flagrant violation of relevant UN Security Council resolutions. On the military engagement side, the confrontation produced moments where the competing narratives from Washington and Tehran diverged so completely that the world was left trying to determine what actually happened with no independent verification available. Iran's IRIB state broadcaster, citing unnamed military officials, claimed that 3 U.S. Navy destroyers came under Iranian missile fire in the Strait of Hormuz and were forced to flee into the Gulf of Oman after sustaining damage. Iran's Tasnim news agency, linked to the IRG, stated that U.S. military units had come under Iranian missile fire and, after sustaining damage, were forced to flee. CENTCOM's response was categorical. No U.S. Navy ships had been struck. American warships had intercepted incoming threats, missiles, drones, and small boats and conducted self-defense strikes against Iranian military facilities tied to the attacks. No damage, no casualties, no retreat. The USS Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier at the center of U.S. operations, continued to launch aircraft in support of CENTCOM's campaign without interruption. Throughout the period, Iran's claims were, CENTCOM said flatly, false. Like and subscribe, because the gap between what Iran says happened and what CENTCOM says happened in the Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrative dispute. It is a window into how both sides are fighting not just a military war but an information war for domestic audiences, for the global energy market, and for the countries watching from the sidelines who have to decide what to believe. The question of who is telling the truth about any given engagement in the Strait of Hormuz is complicated by the fact that the waters themselves are essentially opaque to independent verification. There are no neutral observers with cameras on every destroyer. There is no independent maritime authority with the ability to inspect claimed damage on U.S. warships. There are shipping companies reporting attacks on their vessels, maritime tracking services logging incidents, and satellite imagery confirming some of what Each side claims, but the granular reality of what happened in a specific engagement at 2 in the morning in the middle of the most contested 21 miles of ocean in the world is almost never definitively verifiable from open sources. What is verifiable is the pattern. American ships are transiting, Iranian forces are attacking. Them, US forces are responding, ships are being disabled, and the commercial traffic that the global economy depends on is still not flowing normally through the strait. The human cost of all of this extends far beyond the military personnel on both sides. Of the 1,500 vessels originally trapped in the Persian Gulf when the closure began, many remained stranded weeks into the conflict. 10 civilian sailors of various nationalities were killed in Hormuz-related incidents surrounding the U.S. destroyer transit of May 7. 12 seafarers were reported killed or missing across the broader Hormuz crisis as of early May. One port worker in Bahrain was killed and 2 were wounded in related incidents. 7 commercial ships were abandoned by their crews after being damaged in attacks, left drifting or at anchor in contested waters with no one aboard to move them. The environmental risk of damaged and abandoned tankers in one of the world's busiest oil shipping lanes, the potential for a major fuel spill in an area already under military stress, is a catastrophe that has not yet materialized but remains a live and unmanaged risk. The U.S. military's own losses in the broader conflict were significant. The Pentagon wound count stood at 365 or more as of early May 2026. Independent estimates placed the figure higher, between 520 and 538 wounded, according to tallies compiled by The Intercept and other outlets. A congressional research service report published on May 20, 2026, established 42 U.S. military aircraft as the consolidated platform loss total across the conflict to date. The KC-135 tanker crash in western Iraq on March 12, which killed 6 service members, had already illustrated the catastrophic cost of equipment failures and operational tempo in a sustained air campaign. The U.S. had used approximately 14% of its entire THAAD interceptor missile stockpile against Iranian threats. The economic cost of the conflict, which began at an estimated $11.3 billion in just the first 6 days, had climbed two estimates between $25 and $35 billion by early April, according to the American Enterprise Institute. On the diplomatic front, the situation remained as intractable as ever even as the military exchanges continued. Iran and the United States agreed to a ceasefire on April 7 and 8 of 2026, but that ceasefire existed alongside ongoing blockade enforcement, ongoing Iranian missile launches, and ongoing US self-defense strikes. Trump had told Congress in writing that hostilities with Iran had terminated, that there had been no exchange of fire between us and Iranian forces since April 7. Iran was firing missiles at American bases in Kuwait. The U.S. was disabling Iranian tankers. The ceasefire was a legal construct that both sides cited when convenient and ignored when it suited their operational objectives. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said, after the Project Freedom confrontations, that the events in the Hormuz on Monday made clear there's no military solution to a political crisis. Trump, for his part, described Iran's leaders publicly as lunatics and warned Tehran that they needed to quickly sign a deal with Washington or face further consequences. The nuclear memorandum of understanding remained unsigned through all of this. Trump's terms included Iranian removal of highly enriched uranium from its territory and binding Hormuz access commitments. He also ruled out unfreezing Iranian funds, removing the most obvious economic sweetener. Iran had established the Persian Gulf Strait Authority on May 5 as its formal mechanism for regulating strait transit and institutional assertion of sovereignty the U.S. regarded as illegitimate, and that the U.S. Treasury formally sanctioned on May 28, two sides, both claiming legal authority over the same body of water, both enforcing those claims with live weapons, while the world's most critical oil shipping corridor remained closed to normal traffic. The scale of what is at stake in this standoff is not fully captured by any single statistic, but a few numbers together tell the story in a way that should register with anyone who drives a car, pays an electricity bill, or buys food from a store that gets its products on a ship. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day in normal times. Oil above $100 per barrel is already placing strain on economies that were just beginning to recover from years of post-pandemic inflation. The OECD has projected that a prolonged disruption persisting into 2027 would reduce global economic growth to 1.8%, a figure last seen during the global financial crisis and the COVID pandemic. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve has been depleted by 14%, 58 million barrels to cushion the impact, entering hurricane season with less capacity to respond to future supply shocks. Every additional week that the Strait of Hormuz remains closed or restricted is not just a military story. It is a price at the pump story, a food security story, a jobs story, and an inflation story for billions of people who have no vote in any of the decisions being made in Washington, Tehran, or Tel Aviv. What the world is watching in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not simply a confrontation between two militaries. It is a contest between two fundamentally different theories of how this conflict ends. The American theory is that sustained military pressure disabling tankers, bombing missile bunkers, enforcing the blockade, destroying fast boats will eventually raise the cost of Iran's resistance to the point where Tehran accepts terms on the nuclear deal and Hormuz access that the US can call a victory. The Iranian theory is that the economic pain of a closed or restricted strait, the political cost of American military operations against commercial shipping, and the global pressure from countries whose economies depend on Persian Gulf oil will eventually force Washington to accept terms that preserve more of Iran's leverage than it intended to concede. Both theories are operating simultaneously. Both sides believe they are winning the long game, and in the middle in the 21 miles of contested water between Iran and Oman, ships are being disabled, missiles are being fired, sailors are trapped, and the world is holding its breath waiting to find out which theory of this conflict turns out to be right. Like and subscribe because this story is not over, not by a long measure, and every day it continues. The stakes for the world's economy, for the sailors trapped in the Gulf, and for the fragile ceasefire that both sides simultaneously honor and violate, grow a little bit higher and a little bit harder to walk back. Let us now go deeper into the specific weapons and tactics that both sides are using in the strait, because the operational detail matters enormously for understanding who has the advantage in any given phase of this confrontation and where the vulnerabilities lie on each side. Iran's primary tools in the maritime domain are a layered combination of mines, fast attack craft, anti-ship missiles, and armed drones, all coordinated from command and control nodes on Qeshm Island and the Iranian mainland coast. The mines represent the longest-lasting operational problem. Anti-mine operations began in mid-April, but the U.S. Navy no longer maintains the dedicated mine countermeasure force that supported previous Gulf operations. The clearance task has been handed to expeditionary detachments and unmanned underwater systems whose throughput is limited. Open source assessments suggest full clearance of the Central Strait would require weeks or months even under permissive conditions, and the strait is about as far from permissive as an operational environment can be. The Irg Navy's fast and shore attack craft are the second major layer of Iran's maritime strategy, small, fast, and maneuverable. They operate in swarms from bases close to the navigable channels, directed by shore-based command posts that can saturate the strait from multiple directions simultaneously. They force us destroyers to engage multiple threats while also protecting the commercial vessels they are escorting. The destruction of 7 Iranian fast attack craft during Project Freedom was a significant tactical victory, but the Irg retains substantial inventory of these vessels, and replacing them is a far smaller logistical challenge than replacing a destroyer. Iran's anti-ship missile capability drew the most dramatic US response, the GBU-72 bunker-busting strikes on March 17. The missiles in Iran's underground coastal bunkers are primarily Chinese and Russian-derived anti-ship cruise missiles with ranges covering the entire strait and beyond. Destroying the bunkers reduces Iran's ability to conduct massed salvos, but mobile missile launchers, trucks that can drive, deploy, fire, and relocate before targeting, are significantly harder to neutralize from the air. CENTCOM has claimed to have degraded the mobile launcher threat, not eliminated it, in an environment where a single surviving launcher can still put a ship-killing missile into a tanker or a destroyer. That distinction matters enormously. The drone dimension deserves attention because it represents Iran's most effective asymmetric weapon applied in the worst possible geography for the defender. The Helios laser aboard USS Preble has been confirmed to have engaged Iranian drones in combat. But the strait's narrow geometry means drones can be launched from Qeshm Island, from fast boats inside the strait, or from coastal positions within visual range of the navigable channels, giving defenders extremely compressed response timelines. A drone covering the distance from Qeshm Island to the center of the channel arrives in minutes. A ship's crew must detect, identify, track, engage, and confirm a kill in that window or absorb the hit. Even with Helios, Odin lasers, Patriot batteries, and close-in weapons systems operating simultaneously, the combined drone-boat missile mine threat stresses every defensive layer at once. Like and subscribe because understanding the operational mechanics of why this strait is so difficult to force open is essential to understanding why this confrontation is not going to be resolved quickly, regardless of what the diplomatic headlines say. The commercial shipping industry's response tells its own story about long-term damage that will persist beyond any ceasefire. Our risk insurance premiums for Persian Gulf transits spiked to levels not seen in any previous Gulf crisis, tens of millions of dollars per voyage for large tankers, effectively pricing many operators out of the transit regardless of military conditions. Cape of Good Hope rerouting adds approximately 2 weeks of transit time and enormous additional fuel costs per voyage, costs that flow through two goods prices on every continent. Lloyd's data showed vessel passage rates remained dramatically below the pre-war norm of 100 to 135 transits per day even during partial openings. The global response to the Hormuz crisis has been notable primarily for its incoherence. Trump called on NATO allies to send warships to help reopen the strait, describing it as a shared international responsibility. No allies committed. The EU proposed assigning its naval mission aspides a primary role in mine-clearing operations as part of a France and UK-led coalition to be activated when conditions allow, which is diplomatic language for not while the shooting is still happening. The UN Security Council heard a GCC-sponsored resolution demanding Iran halt attacks on Arab neighbors, but structural divisions with Russia and China aligned with Iran's framing made any enforcement action politically impossible. Every country that depends on Persian Gulf oil was calculating how long it could absorb the economic shock, but none had a mechanism for intervening that did not require choosing a side in a conflict between the United States and Iran. China's position deserves attention, as the largest single importer of Persian Gulf oil and one of Iran's most important trading partners. China was absorbing direct economic pain from the Hormuz closure even while publicly condemning US strikes and signaling diplomatic solidarity with Tehran, but China was not willing to militarily confront the United States in the Strait, of confrontation it was not prepared for. Its strategy has been to provide diplomatic cover for Iran, quietly encourage a negotiated resolution, and absorb the economic shock while waiting to see whether the outcome could be leveraged into a post-conflict order more favorable to its long-term interests. It is the long game. Patience that Washington's short political cycle makes difficult to counter. The story of the Strait of Hormuz in 2026 is ultimately a story about the limits of military power in a geography that systematically rewards defensive attrition over offensive forcing. The United States has the most capable military in the world. It has laser weapons, bunker-busting bombs, carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, and the ability to put 15,000 personnel and over 100 aircraft into a maritime operation on short notice. And yet the strait is still not fully open. Commercial traffic is still not flowing normally. The diplomatic deal is still unsigned. The trapped sailors are still waiting. The oil is still priced above the level that comfortable global economic growth requires. Iran does not need to win in any conventional military sense. It only needs to make the cost of forcing the strait open in dollars, in diplomatic capital, in domestic political patience, in military hardware high enough that the United States eventually decides that an imperfect diplomatic resolution is better than a perfect military victory that keeps slipping just out of reach. That is the strategic reality inside the Strait of Hormuz right now. Iran is firing missiles. America is bombing ships, sailors are trapped, the world is watching, and the 21 miles of contested water between Iran and Oman remains the most consequential piece of ocean on Earth, the place where the military, economic, and diplomatic futures of the current global order are being contested in real time, one disabled tanker and one intercepted missile at a time. Like and subscribe, because what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz is not background noise. It is the story of your world changing, and you deserve to understand every dimension of it.